Chalmers. I'm a vice president of the Sunapee Historical Society. I've lived down the street at 114 Garnet Street since 1957, so I'm an old timer here in town. But thank you for inviting me to your annual meeting to share some historical information that I've gathered about Perkins Pond for my now upcoming book. I thought it would be done by now, but it's not. Hopefully around Thanksgiving. But around 1800, Perkins Pond was called Breeches Pond, and by 1840, it was called Ryder Pond, and it wasn't until the 1850s that it was known as Perkins Pond, and that name stuck. The Perkins family lived on a 70-acre farm on the north side of the pond, and that's Mario Capozzoli's home today. This photo is of the North Shore, land owned by Margaret Tarzia. So this is a proprietor's lot map on the left, and a blown up section of Perkins Pond. There were 5 farms shown by dots around the perimeter that existed until around 1900. Today, I count there's 104 cottages and homes at the pond. Next. So at the north side, a farm was started by Samuel Corliss of Ware in 1798 and sold 8 years later for $500 to Enoch Perkins. This was the Perkins family farm until 1867, and the pond was named for his family. In 1877, Elijah Ryder, a neighbor from down the road, bought this farm for his daughter, Francina Gage, and her husband, who lived here until 1927. They sold land for one pond cottage on the North Shore. From 1927, the farm became a summer home until the 40s, when Arthur Davis and Reed Lewin of Davis and Simons Lumber Company of Claremont bought the farm. They subdivided the farm's pond acreage into 25 pond lots. For 58 years, from 1949 until 2007, the old Perkins farmhouse was the Uford family summer home. The house still exists today at 140 Perkins Pond Road. The farm at the southwest side of Perkins Pond was the Philip Eastman homestead, also built around 1800, with land in Croydon and in Sunapee. There were 2 houses, but only this one exists today, just over the Croydon-Sunapee line on Ryder Corner Road. The farm was next owned by Philip's son Moses Eastman until the 1840s, and then his brother James Eastman owned it and lived there for nearly 40 years until his death, when it was inherited by his son, William Eastman. He sold the right to log the farm's land in 1920 to the New England Box Company. And in 1928, Robert Dockster of Sunapee bought the farm, the logged-off farm, and lived here with his family. He built 3 rental cottages at his Perkins Pond shore around 1930, and by 38 had sold 5 more cottage lots before selling his farm to Asa Cutting. Asa sold 19 pond cottage lots during the 1950s on the southwest shore. The land of the pond's southeast shore was part of Samuel George's homestead, also built in the late 1790s. This farm was owned by several generations of the family, and it was Elman George who sold the first cottage lot from his farm's land in 1908. Then, in 1930, his daughter Mamie owned the farm and sold her shoreland to Burton and Elizabeth Cady Point. The farm remained in the George family until 1944. In the 1950s, 15 cottage lots along Piney Point Road were sold when this farm was owned by Newport developer George Dane. Since 1958, the farm, still intact except for the shore lots, has been owned by Gordon Ramspot and today is owned by his son Dana. North of Samuel George's place was his brother Elijah George, and he built this farmhouse house at the corner of Perkins Pond and Road and North Road. In 1892, brothers Elmer and Wesley Rowell, who grew up in the big house shown in the upper left at Ryder Corner, bought the farm from the Georges for $1,200. In 1932, Wesley began selling cottage lots on the pond's east shore, accessed by his logging road that was later called Burma Road. He sold 15 lots before selling all his real estate to his brother Selwyn in 1941. Selwyn Rowell was a wealthy cattle rancher who lived with his family at the family homestead at Ryder Corner. In '38, he bought the William Eastman farm at the southwest pond shore and also the Ryder farm on the northwest shore. But when he bought the Elijah George farm in '41, Selwyn immediately sold it for $1,500 to Ralph Leone. Ralph was a contractor and a farmer who loved to experiment with plants, especially the Sunapee peach tree. He sold 5 lots at his pond shore along Burma Road. In 2013, the old Leone house was torn down, but a barn still exists today at the site. About 1807, Caleb Mudgett of Ware bought the 85-acre lot on the Croydon line at the end of Perkins Pond Road, where he built a small house and a sawmill. This is a picture of a sawmill. It's not his sawmill, but it's very much like his sawmill. The land extended south to Perkins Pond Brook. The Mudgett sawmill was about 200 feet north of the road, and in 1849 was purchased for $340 by James Trow with 2 acres of land. This was the first Trow sawmill, which James improved by building 2 more upstream dams to ensure steady water flow. His son Willis worked with him, and when James died in 1875, the sawmill was sold to their neighbors, the Ryders, and Willis Trow bought an interest in a lower village sawmill. Willis's grandson, Jeff Trow, still operates the Trow mill at the lower Main Street. But this old sawmill site, now part of the 2019 McWilliams Conservation Land, still has its stone foundations and dam. The remaining 83 acres of the Mudgett farm was sold by the family in 1832 to Ebenezer Bartlett, who soon lost the farm to foreclosure. 6 years later, Daniel Ryder of Croydon bought it, and this is where his brother Jotham Ryder built this house around 1839. The farm remained in the family for 60 years. In 1910, Sunapee land speculators George Bartlett and his son Ernest bought the farm. The Bartletts had built Indian Cave Lodge over here on Lake Avenue. And they sold this farm in several pieces. From 1938 to 71, the farm had 5 different owners, but then was bought by the McWilliams family that still owns it. From the 1870s into the 1900s, Perkins Pond attracted locals from Newport and Croydon for fishing and camping on its shores. In 1886, Newport was looking for a new drinking water source and had the water at Perkins Pond tested. The pond's water was not drinking water quality, with its high volume of organic solids and free ammonia, indicating that there had been a great amount of decomposed animal and plant matter in the water. In 1885, Frank Reed, who owned a water-powered sawmill in North Newport, needed more water, and for $1,000 he bought the right to raise and flood Sylvester Rowell's land that created a new pond called Reed's Overflow that we know today as Loon Lake in Croydon. Although Frank's sawmill burned down in 1895, he rebuilt it right away. Wanting still more water, in 1901, he contracted with the 8 landowners around Perkins Pond to build a dam and raise the level of the pond by 4 feet, flooding up to 100 acres of its shoreline over a 50-year period. Frank built the dam at the pond's outlet brook broke over the line in Croydon, but died in 1913. This photo shows the dam today, which no longer holds back pond water. During the first decade of the 1900s, the first 4 cottages were built at Perkins Pond. Here are the stories of 2 of them. The first cabin at Perkins Pond was built on its only island around 1906. The actual date is unknown, for no deeds were recorded by its owners, Guy Whittier and George Brown, but its location shows that it was part of Lot 1 in the 3rd North Range, and so it may have been sold to them by William Eastman. Island ownership continued in the Brown family to his daughter May and her husband Frank Wynn, and then to their sons. Since 1990, neighbors Linda and Dundee Nestler have owned the island that was once known as Wynn Camp and now as Isle View. Next. The second cabin built at the pond was on the North Shore at Francina and Charles Gage's farm. In 1907, they sold a 100 by 200 foot pond lot for $100 to Charles Stratton of Newport, and he built this cabin probably during the following year. He lived here with his wife and 2 stepsons for a few years as they worked in the Newport shoe factory. But by 1913, they moved to Manchester for work, leaving the cottage to be rented out by the Gages. In 1926, Walter Darling, a loom fixer at the Door Woolen Mill in Guile, bought the cottage, and where he and his wife lived. She was the daughter of Frank Wynn, who owned the island, owned the cottage out on the island. Today, this cottage is still owned by descendants of the Darling family. So during the 1920s, logging occurred around the pond. Here is Asa Larry's mill, set up in 1929 on the Docksters land at the southwest shore of the pond. He got into trouble twice while working at the pond. Once for operating without a spark arrestor or risking a forest fire, and then a few weeks later for allowing sawdust from the mill to accumulate in the pond. During the 1930s, Perkins Pond experienced a cabin building boom with about 10 cabins built, and nearly all of them by Newport families who worked in its woolen or shoe mills. Many were of Finnish descent. Here are a few. Between 1929 and 1933, Robert Dockster built 3 cabins on his southwest shore. None of those cabins exist today, but at upper left is a photo of one that used to be at 120 Mary's Road. In 1936 to 45, this cabin was owned by Claude and Doris Stetson of Newport. Their son Gardner later returned to the pond. At lower left, in 1932, Wesley Rowell sold this first cottage lot for $125 to Converse Courier and his son-in-law Howard Bennett. They built the first cabin on the East Shore at 24 Burma Road. Okay. At upper left, in 1930, So at upper left, Wesley Rowell sold this lot for $125 to Wilhelm Mackey, a Finnish immigrant who lived in Newport with his wife. They both worked at the Newport shoe factory. Wilhelm was also a carpenter and built this cottage at 60 Burma Road. The cottage was sold in 1951 when his wife's health was poor. At lower left is the cottage at 80 Burma Road, built by Oiva Mattila on land bought from Wesley Rowell in 1938. Oiva was a weaver and then a loom fixer at the Newport woolen mills. He and his wife retired to this cottage in 1960 and lived here for the rest of their lives. In September 1938, the September 1938 hurricane caused widespread damage throughout New England and downed about 4 billion board feet of timber. But over the next 3 years, less than 1 billion was actually salvaged. Much of New Hampshire and all of Sullivan County was hard hit. In February 1939, Perkins Pond went under contract to receive salvaged logs from several tracts in Croydon and in Sunapee, including the down trees from the old Ryder farm at the northwest pond shore. Sawmills were set up near storage sites for cutting the logs into boards. Then, in April 1941, a huge edging and planing sawmill was set up near the Mount Sunapee traffic circle to finish the boards for shipment by rail using the Edgemont Railroad Station. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find documentation to know how many board feet were stored, removed, or sank at Perkins Pond. That information exists for Otter Pond, but as I said, I haven't found it yet for Perkins. Next. During the 1940s, a few cabins were built before the war, but nearly all of the remaining cabins were built after the war. At upper left is 44 Burma Road, built in 1943 by Georgiana and Ted Nichols, who had operated the Giles store and post office. In 1980, this was Gloria and Gardner Stetson's second cottage at Perkins Pond. Gardner was for many years the blacksmith on Oak Street in Newport. At lower left is the cottage built in 1949 at 100 Burma Road by Ralph and Ramona Meacham. Ralph was a school administrator, and this house is today owned by their daughter. So I hope that you found this quick overview of Perkins Pond history interesting, and I'm sure to let you all know when the book is ready, I hope around Thanksgiving. Thank you.